Brian Newman used to be the CEO of Tribeca Film Festival, but he left to start his own company, Subgenre. Brian really does have one of the smartest brains about the future of films and festivals, and generally what's next for the industry. So it was a pleasure to sit down and chat with him. Hi, Brian.
Howdy.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So look, right now, obviously there's quite a lot of tension in the world of movies, in the world of Hollywood. And I would say that perhaps at the root of that tension has been a difficulty bringing together the worlds of tech and the future possibilities of that, the worlds of brands who don't have a long-standing history with being production companies, and the worlds of artists. Now, a lot of your career seems to be about bringing those things together.
Right.
Can you see a more, a positive future for this relationship? Are we at a nadir right now?
I think it's been a pretty turbulent time, but the reason I'm working at that intersection is I do think that's a place of possibility for some interesting things to happen. It's also, to be frank up front, a perilous place, because anytime you bring brands into the conversation, they can turn it into just pure marketing babble. So my hope is if you can nail that right mix where you've got companies and brands that are trying to make something people actually want to watch, and not just watch, but tell someone else they should watch it too, and are focused on doing something more high quality, that can be a couple things, a new point of funding for quality projects, because the financial picture for making good cinema has been pretty shaky. But the second thing is brands understand marketing and how to get other eyeballs on something. And that's been one of our biggest problems in the film field, is most film people don't know a thing about marketing, or aggregating audiences in any way. So I think there's a lot of potential there. However, you don't want to, I always say, you don't want to end up with just a bunch of talking tacos for Taco Bell, bad advertising. And so I'm trying to work at that juncture where, more like Saint Laurent funding Almodovar to make a film, which they did this year, which is like a true movie that played at the Cannes Film Fest, and it's getting released by real distributors to regular audiences. And it's not seen as an advertisement, but it aligns with the brand's interest as well as the artist's interest.
In general, how do artists kind of react to this type of idea? Because artists are, quite conservative in some ways. Absolutely.
It's interesting. I think about 10 years ago, a lot of artists that I know that you would call auteurs, so to speak, this was anathema. They didn't want anything to do with this sector. And that's changed dramatically in the last few years to where people are calling me up, begging me to introduce them to brands that might fund their work. And I think there's still healthy skepticism, and quality artists want to make sure they're not working with brands that have the same values they do. They don't want to necessarily work with, say, Exxon or, someone in that space. And they don't want to work with someone who's doing what we call brand washing, where they're really, trying to cover over some other controversy they're going through. So that healthy skepticism is good, but there's a lot more openness to it. I mean, I don't think you would have seen Almodovar and Cronenberg and big name directors like that
Wes Anderson,
doing these kind of films just a few years ago even. But there's more openness to it now.
And what about from the brand perspective? I mean, don't get me wrong, I like going and watching art house movies, but I wonder if I could sit in a room and convince, like a hard-nosed executive at Cartier that the most important thing that they could do would be fund a cockeyed view of the world from, a particular artist.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work for every brand. And I think why you saw the best auteur example being a fashion brand, because they kind of are aligning themselves with arts and culture in a different way. That's not going to necessarily work for just randomly pulling out of a hat, a bank or something like that, or more of a consumer focused product company. What I'm finding is happening more often is, and this is why it's not going to be a solution for the entire field, but it does work very well for documentaries, because you have to remember a lot of companies, they're not just trying to sell product. They're also trying to build their brand with consumers around some kind of values proposition and what they stand for. And also they've got their own employees that they're trying to recruit and retain, and people feel better about working at a place that cares about something. So a lot of times the companies I'm working with are doing this as much for those reasons as for selling a product. So if they know, for example, we did a project with Publicis Sapient, which is a big tech consulting firm, and it was about something in the criminal justice sector that their technology helps with, but it wasn't about their brand. But it enabled their staff to be able to say to their mom for the first time, like, that's the kind of work we end up doing. Like, our software let that happen, where this person got out of prison because they could prove that they had this history that they should go into mental health treatment instead of criminal justice system. They've never been able to explain to their parents what the heck they do before. That to Publicis Sapient is a reason to do those kind of films. But most of the brands I'm working with, it's more like Patagonia, which is an outdoor company, and they care a lot about climate change and environmental issues and sustainability. And so when they're making a film, it might have a surfer in it, which they sell surf equipment, but instead of just beauty shots of a surfer, it's also about their activism around illegal ocean dumping or something like that. So those films have an audience. There's an audience that wants to watch those films and learn more about it, maybe take action on an issue. There's no product placement for the brand in there whatsoever. But if you go to shop later and buy a Patagonia jacket, arguably you're going to feel better buying it from them than someone else, because they stand for certain values. That's the sweet spot for a lot of them. That's not going to solve the 75% of the films that Locarno plays that are more, auteur-driven artistic films. They're not going to overlap. So I'm not trying to say that our entire conversation should be about brands, for one, or two, that the film industry's conversation should be about brands. I just think it's one little piece of the puzzle that can help towards the future.
Well, I mean, clearly there's the need for alternative, funding models, right?
Yeah.
Angel Studios is an interesting one.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they put out The Sound of Freedom. I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't seen it. It doesn't really appeal to me. But the model, which I've seen you write about, of basically approaching people who are kind of, how do I say, that their politics point in the same direction as those of the filmmaker,
right?
And encouraging them to effectively, crowdfund the project and then go out and buy loads of tickets for cinemas, which may well sit there empty with nobody walking in and watching the movie, but still allows that film to, at least for a 1 week, eclipse Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. It's fascinating, but I'm interested to know if you think that works for any group of people who aren't like QAnon adjacent, white savior imperialists.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the politics of the film studio, which are probably not as crazy right-wing QAnon adjacent as people are starting to say they are. I think they actually, they come from a Mormon background. The founders do. Yeah. And so it's definitely Christian and it's a little bit more conservative, but I don't think they're embracing the conspiracy theories the way people think they are. But what they've done is, what's important to do is strip away all of that and just look at the business model behind it, which is there are niche audiences that are underserved, that care passionately about certain types of content. And they tapped into that audience and has them involved in as a crowd in everything from selecting the projects they do to funding them to then funding the distribution of them, like literally funding the P&A, print and advertising, marketing expenses, and then doing this idea of pay it forward where they're buying tickets for someone who can't afford to get a ticket or isn't sure they want to go to the film. So every aspect of the chain, they've crowdsourced, which crowdsourcing has been around, Kickstarter's been around, but they tied it to that niche audience. So,
and at the end of the film, the star comes on screen and says, "Pay it forward. Come on, guys, get out your phone and buy a ticket."
And not only that, the beginning of the film, the star of the film says it's important that you watch this in theaters and that other people watch it in theaters. Theaters are a sacred space. Now, I believe theaters are a sacred space just as a cinema goer. I think they're also kind of intoning that it's sacred, almost like a church, but it works for their audience. And at the end of the film, they're saying, pay it forward, get other people to see this, buy a ticket. That could also work for people who care about environmental issues, sustainability. That's a niche audience that really cares about the content. It also works for another thing I'm not as into, but it works for people who are into alternative health and lifestyles and yoga and mindfulness. And if you think about it, when Gary Hustwit, the filmmaker, made Helvetica, a movie about a font, that gets millions of people who are obsessed with design that come out for that. That same model would work for that audience, people who are obsessed with design and architecture and art. And a lot of times Hollywood's not paying for those films. I think it also is true for certain demographic audiences. So the fastest growing, most active community in the United States, at least I know, for films is actually Latino and Hispanic audiences. And they're extremely underserved in terms of content made for and by their community. And if someone tapped into that audience, I think that would work in that same model.
How are we measuring that audience growth?
That's being measured by people like ComScore and Box Office Mojo, and just seeing like who's demographically showing up in the theaters. They over-index going to movies, even though when you survey that audience, they're saying, I love going to movies, but I don't see enough with people who look like me on the screen.
Sure.
Or directed by people who look like me. And if you think about it, about more than 10 years ago, not using the same Angel Studios model whatsoever, but that was kind of what happened with Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry, in the US is a very big, popular mainstream filmmaker who's obviously not going to have a film that plays Locarno. It's more of a mainstream pop culture thing. But he realized there was a sizable Black audience in the US that was somewhat conservative in terms of their culture. Like they go to church, they care about religion. And so he makes films that are comedies that serve that audience, but are also family friendly enough, that they can say in the film, something related to prayer or God, and it's not going to turn off that audience. And Hollywood wasn't making films for that audience. And now he's the most prolific, probably most successful filmmaker in America because he tapped into that audience. If he was doing it today, he'd probably do the Angel Studios model where it would be crowdsourced from beginning to end. And I think the film community needs to, it's not going to work necessarily for, the typical film that plays on the piazza necessarily here, but it does work for certain niche audiences.
No, but it's the interesting thing, right? Actually, a broad-ranging drama, which once upon a time would have people would have been a better bet to support because 75% of people can get with this.
Yeah.
Actually doesn't work at all. What you got to do is find that 25% and then hypermarket it at those people, which is effectively what digital companies and brands have been doing for 15 years.
And that's what the film community, I don't think, has woken up to yet, is that it used to be that all those niche audiences were dispersed and you couldn't connect them as well. And now everyone's connected through Facebook, et cetera. Yeah. And they can talk to each other on TikTok or other social media. And so your audience is no longer these little tiny pockets. You can actually hit them all at the same time globally. And that's actually what Angel Studios is now doing. They started very US centric, but are moving towards opening it internationally. And they're doing it direct to their audience. They're developing direct to theater relationships. So they're not going through a third party. And
they're doing it through churches?
they are marketing into churches, but
Gotcha.
they're getting people to go to the actual movie theater. And my understanding is, and by the way, I haven't seen the movie either, and I'm not a fan of that type of film. I'm a fan of the business model. The more I've been researching it, it does appear that it's legitimate. Like there's a myth going around that there's no one showing up for the movies, but they've had conversations on Reddit and on message boards that are like for theater owners and operators. And people are saying like, no, people are showing up for these movies. That's why we keep booking it, because the audience is actually coming to the film as well. So there's definitely some people who are buying a ticket, redeeming it online, but then not going to the movie theater just to try to drive up the numbers. But that seems to be a smaller percentage than what the naysayers are making it seem like. That the audience is there. And I think that would be true for other projects too. And I think that now when you've got that kind of film that has that niche audience, not necessarily something that appeals to that Christian audience, but any sizable niche audience, that audience exists in, Bulgaria and Romania and the US and Canada and Africa. You can tap into them now and bring them together in a way you couldn't before.
I mean, it's not a million miles away what they did with the Passion of the Christ.
No, yeah, very similar.
Just with, I guess, better digital networks out there. That's effectively the only difference.
Yeah, but that film did pretty well too. And,
very, very well.
Yeah, and
also starred Jim Caviezel.
Yeah, and so look, that's undoubtedly also just part of the equation that you can't deny, which is there is a religious audience that's going to come out for those films, and they watch some stuff that's pretty bad.
They're literally devout.
Yeah, so. Exactly. So, I don't want to intimate that. I can't think of a good example of a filmmaker right now, but you're not going to get that for a Bellatar film in the same way.
But with a different type of marketing, you might be able to get it for a Wes Anderson film,
right? And I think the bigger thing to me is just that the film industry, for the most part, has been its own blend of conservatism, meaning they just it was always plug and play.
Sure.
And the way distribution and marketing has worked has been not very original. And I think what was brilliant about Angel Studios was just them realizing we can market crowdfunding in a different way than the way Kickstarter is doing it. And we can do it with a specific audience a certain way, use different terminology that appeals to our audience. And I just think that filmmakers and film industry can think about it. How can they apply that same model to themselves? Take away little pieces of it. Not every single aspect is going to apply to every movie, but some aspects of it can help us think of new ways of marketing films, which we desperately need.
I mean, beyond kind of cinematic distribution, I'm interested in what your perspective is on kind of digital distribution, on alternative streamers, and whether or not you think the future of digital release will remain in the hands of 3 or 4 very large companies with fantastic tech and great players, or if we really are going to see a very successful explosion of alternative streamers. I know there are a lot, but I wonder if they could ever take a larger portion of the market.
I wonder too. So I'm not sure. So I think you nailed actually one of the central questions, and no one's really sure right now, just to be really honest. I think my feeling is we seem to be finding that streaming is not the best business model. It seemed like it was, Netflix was working out pretty well, but it wasn't a great revenue generator, net revenue generator for a long time. And it seems to be that I think what we're going to find out is that you can only operate a streamer if you also have another business that makes money around it. So if you're Amazon and you're selling tons of diapers and other items, and you happen to also have movies, that's a value add for your Prime membership.
Yeah.
That works. If you're Disney and have theme parks and things like that as well, you have a physical business, Apple, you have computers you're selling, that can work. And I think Netflix even will be bought up by one of those operators before long. My hope is that as that consolidation happens and you've got just, we're back to where we have, in the US, we had 3 broadcasters and now I have like 2 or 3 streamers, that maybe there'll be room for niche players to come in. They're able to tap into those niche communities. But I am worried that the types of films I love, the ones that I would go see here at this festival or any other film fest I go to, often don't fall into that rubric of, hitting the Christian market or hitting the alternative health and lifestyle market and meditation or whatever. Is there a big enough audience for art house and independent cinema to make a niche? And I'm not sure there is. I hope there is, but historically, that type of film falls to the wayside in every other technical marvel we've had.
I mean, and this is ultimately the problem with that kind of that super niche micro marketing that we've been talking about, is that actually what it will probably tend to reward are filmmakers or films that are very kind of that are telling the audience what they want to believe, that are reassuring their values, whereas most of the films that play somewhere like this, most of art house films actually are there to make you feel quite weird and question everything you think about.
Yeah. But then you get 8,000 people in the piazza, and not every film that's playing out there is Bullet Train. I mean, there's some difficult, hard films and people are coming but it's an event.
Yeah.
So it works in an event. The question is, can you turn the online experience into an event? And I think that's something film festivals are trying to figure out and the industry is trying to figure out, and we haven't nailed it yet, but there's what has worked are things like Turner Classic Movies.
Hey man, but to be fair, it had to be saved by Paul Thomas Anderson and Steven Spielberg.
But only because they got bought by a big conglomerate that doesn't care so much about them. But they've always been profitable, actually, and they've built a sizable audience. And it started just as a channel, but then they've eventized it on the channel itself, and that you've got smart people talking about the movies in between them. You're getting retrospectives that are thematically organized the way you would do at a film fest. And then they've done things like the Turner Classic Festival, the Turner Classic Cruise, and people show up in droves. I mean, their cruise, I hate cruises. I'll never go on a cruise, but that cruise sells out faster than any other cruise.
Yeah. You don't
no, I don't fancy dysentery at all. I don't know why anyone goes on a cruise.
Me neither.
But my wife wants to go because she loves classic movies and is like, wow, I could spend an entire week just doing that. It would be pretty cool. I'm like, you can go with your parents. I'll let you go without me. But my point is that, there is a small bit of hope that maybe a movie or someone like them could capture that marketplace in the future. But I think it's going to have to be by tying that audience together globally, not worrying about time zones and geographic boundaries the way our industry's been set up. It's all about selling territories. Like, you sell the rights to the film in Switzerland and in Germany and Italy all separately. Each distributor is doing something separate. That model doesn't work in an online world. But
it's about these, TCM's a great example, right? Because look, I'm from England. We don't get Turner Classic Movies. But in the last few years, it's really kind of lurched into my life as a coherent brand, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's basically, I guess whether or not it's a streaming company or just distribution companies, or if they're production companies as well, but they effectively have to think of themselves as a Disney or an A24 or a Vice, where it's like they produce things, but they have an identity.
Yeah, you have to build a brand.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they've done well and over time. And Criterion's done that.
I mean, better than almost anyone.
Yeah. But there's very few others that have. I mean, it's interesting that A24 has been able to, but aside from them, the average even cinema lover doesn't really know a lot of the other brands distributing their films.
No, but I mean, there's space to do it.
Yeah.
And actually, as kind of digital media crumbles, there is also space to operate in those fields. The problem is that digital media is not supportable unless you have an actual business model, which these companies do because they distribute films.
Yeah. But I also think that's where there's room, and no brand has done it yet, but I actually think that's where the overlap that I was talking about before with brands and film can be interesting, because you could see, especially in the fashion world, a Gucci or someone was pulling out of a hat, saying like, actually our brand should be about these kind of like movies that matter. And maybe they're a little bit quirky and fit our brand in certain ways, but they've got a physical business. They've got a marketing arm. They know how to brand things. And that could be a piece of their brand too. WeTransfer is trying to do that with We Present. They're very focused on fine artists and cutting edge filmmakers and trying to build their brand around that. We'll see if it works.
Sure.
But that's what they're trying to do. And they won an Oscar already. They funded Riz Ahmed's short that won the Oscar this past year, not this year, but the year prior. So they're onto something. And they're also financing fine artists and galleries that are doing interesting shows. And there's that space in London, actually. Can you remind me if you've probably heard of it? It's like Outer Space or Other Space or something. Outerness.
I don't actually know. Sorry.
It's right by one of the tube stations.
My son doesn't go to nursery there. I probably haven't seen it. It's an outdoor, open air, 3D art exhibit, constantly changing video space. I do know it. Yeah. It's in Tottenham Court Road. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah. But they've done a lot of presentations of fine artists doing video works there that they're underwriting, and they're slowly building a brand recognized around that. And I think there's room for others to do that. I think there's room for a handful of festivals to do that. For example, in the US, there's a few festivals that have targeted around genre films, in particular like horror and thriller. So that's a brand that can extend potentially. But
I think there's a very interesting possible future in kind of genre, because obviously everybody talks about horror being, the unbreakable model, the one thing that you can rely on to make money, the one thing that gets people into cinemas, over indexes with women, over indexes with younger audiences. But I actually think the missing trick, and I think action will go down that line as well. And I just think more genre filmmaking. I could see monster movies doing that. I could see lots of different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in that case, probably we should talk about film festivals quite quickly.
Okay.
So you used to run Tribeca, and we're currently at gorgeous Locarno. What do you think how we're talking about the entire industry changing, the entire industry reimagining itself. How do film festivals fit into that?
Yeah, it's the central question for our industry right now. And I think, to be honest, most festivals haven't been doing a great job of addressing it. And there's a reason for that, just to be fair at the beginning of this, is that, we're just coming at this moment. We're still getting impacted by COVID, but we're coming out of that moment when it was really shutting down festivals, and that killed their budgets. And some festivals, they were about to take place, and then the next day they had to shut down. So they'd already spent all the money setting everything up, and, that's hard to recover from. And when you're trying to plug budget gaps, it's hard to have enough mind space to think about the future. And so I think that's why they've been slow to respond. Not just because I'm here, am I saying this, but one of the reasons I am coming here is I think Locarno is actually trying to think about that future. It's one of the few festivals that has a chief innovation officer and has an endowed professorship at the university thinking about these issues. They've got more to do and stuff, but you don't see that same activity of thinking around how do festivals change for the future of film going at very many others. You can even, I would argue that even the most important festival right now in the world is probably Cannes, and they're doing great at what they do, but they're not thinking about the future, and they're not changing whatsoever. And I think,
you can understand why it's a lot of work it's a lot of work to do it already and absolutely. Then change it.
Yeah, absolutely. But festivals are also onto something, which is, it's the eventized nature of it, and people come out for it, and it gets audience members coming out. So how do you think of extending that year round? And it's not an easy solution.
No, it's not, but it's effectively what we're talking about. It's how do you create a brand that exists beyond 12 days? Yeah. It's actually not rocket science, because these places already have a really coherent brand. Yeah. And that is high quality cinema.
Yeah. And so I think it's going to be a mixture of things. It's going to be what each individual festival does. I think also a lot of the small to mid-tier festivals that have not differentiated themselves to their local community are going to probably fall to the wayside and not survive a lot of this transition. But the good ones that are building brands and building it around presence and are keeping artistic integrity in it have a lot of room to grow. And I think there's also going to be possibilities for collaboration amongst festivals. So to this day, I still would love to be able to open up an app that, instead of being Rotten Tomatoes, where it's the entire crowd and every single critic, and some of them I don't know who the hell they are, if I could just look at what the top 20 festival curators think I should see, that would help me narrow down the gazillion options I've got on, Apple, Netflix, Hulu, all my subscriptions, none of which the algorithm is serving me up what I actually want to see.
It's Letterboxd, though, isn't it?
But they're not doing it on Letterboxd right now. A lot of them, the festivals are kind of reluctant to put out what they think about films beyond their festival. I found programmers as a whole, they like to talk about their films in their catalog, but not the rest of the year.
Sure.
But I think they are the trusted voice that we want year round.
And that's just a deeper relationship with the artist that goes on for a large period of time, where you represent for the film for 12 months only solidifies your position inside the industry. Yeah.
And I think there's just a lot of room for growth there. And I think, it's also the other stuff, like what you're doing here with the podcast and trying to make more interesting conversations is one piece of it. I think I could see a lot of interesting things with deeper, more interesting, not surface level PR conversations with the artists and the talent as well.
I mean, yeah. There's a bottomless opportunity there.
Yeah. And I think we forget, and we're kind of in an insular industry where we're talking to each other, but I always use my parents as an example. Like my mom and dad love this kind of stuff and they're not getting served. And they would love to be able to tune in to not just Locarno, but any other festival near them that was, telling them more about films they should see, having an interesting, smart conversation with an actor or director from it, not just, the PR speak type stuff, but something meaningful. And that audience is out there. It's just a lot of times we think it's just the industry and the cinephiles only, but it's broader than we think it is.
Once you put all the cinephiles together on the internet, it turns out that's quite a lot of people.
Yeah. That's been part of our problem all along is we've got, little tiny distributors serving different little audiences, and it bifurcates audiences into these tiny little groups when there's actually probably bigger than you think it is. So
cool. Well, that was very interesting, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the conversation.